All right, let's just jump right into this fascinating explainer of Srila Prabhupada's teachings. Today, we're going to challenge a really fundamental assumption that pretty much all of us make about how we perceive reality. We live in a world that constantly tells us, if we can't see, touch, or measure something, it simply doesn't exist. But what if the very instruments we're using to measure reality are fundamentally broken? So let's start by questioning our modern default setting, materialistic empiricism. We've all heard the phrase, seeing is believing, right? It's basically the battle cry of the modern skeptic. But according to the Vedic scriptures we're unpacking today, standing there with your arms crossed and demanding, show me God, might actually be the ultimate trap. And it's a trap not because the absolute truth isn't there to be seen, but because it exposes this massive, unexamined bias we hold about our own capabilities. We just kind of assume our eyes are perfectly qualified to see absolutely everything. To really wrap our heads around this, we need to look at the Vedic concept of pratyakṣa, which means direct sense perception. Srila Prabhupada cautions us that relying strictly on pratyakṣa is completely inadequate and honestly a highly unreliable path for grasping the supreme reality. Why? Because the problem doesn't lie with the object we're trying to look at, the problem is entirely with our instrument of perception. Think about it like this. If you try to view a distant galaxy through a muddy, severely scratched pair of binoculars, well, you're not going to see a thing. But you wouldn't conclude the galaxy doesn't exist, right? You'd rightfully conclude your binoculars are deeply flawed. Which brings us to Section 1, our blunt and imperfect senses. The source material really brilliantly illustrates the core issue we're dealing with here. In our present state of material consciousness, our senses are actually described as blunt. Just as diseased eyes can't properly see, materially contaminated senses just cannot perceive transcendental reality. Think about that word, blunt. A blunt knife can't cut gracefully, and a blunt sense organ simply cannot perceive delicate transcendental truths. Our inability to see God doesn't mean he's absent. It literally just means our material vision is currently diseased. We're essentially suffering from a kind of spiritual cataract, and demanding to see the absolute truth with these contaminated senses is, well, fundamentally illogical. Srila Prabhupada actually challenges the entire foundation of materialistic empiricism by pointing out 4 inescapable human defects. First off, we're prone to commit mistakes. Who hasn't added up a simple math problem wrong or completely misremembered a major event? Second, we easily become illusioned. This is like mistaking a rope for a snake in a dark room. Our brain just fills in the wrong information. Third, we have a tendency to cheat others, often presenting ourselves as way more knowledgeable than we actually are just to save face. And fourth, our senses themselves are physically imperfect. We literally can't see beyond a certain distance or hear outside of a very specific frequency range. When you stock these 4 universal defects together, those arrogant demands for absolute direct perception start to look pretty foolish. To ground this abstract philosophy, let's look at Section 2, the foolish gold buyer, which is a fantastic analogy from Srila Prabhupada's Los Angeles lecture. Picture this. Someone suddenly decides they want to buy gold. Step 1, they confidently stride right into an ordinary grocery shop seeking this gold. Step 2, they actually have absolutely no knowledge whatsoever about gold. They don't know its weight, its color, its market value, or how to chemically test it. They're utterly ignorant of the subject matter. So what happens in Step 3? Well, a dishonest shopkeeper sees this naive person coming from a mile away. The shopkeeper just hands over a worthless piece of brass or iron, slaps a massive price tag on it, and says, "Here is your gold, my friend." Because the buyer is relying entirely on their untrained eyes, they're completely and thoroughly cheated. Now, that naive gold buyer who lacks knowledge and gets fooled by brass, that is exactly like the materially conditioned person who demands, "Show me God." If you don't understand God's symptoms, his scriptural description, his transcendental qualities, or his spiritual nature, you're walking into the spiritual marketplace completely blind. Your eyes alone cannot protect you. Without genuine, authorized knowledge, mere visual perception is totally insufficient. It leaves you totally exposed, making you a super easy victim for anyone looking to make a quick profit. And that leads us right into Section 3, the danger of deception. When you insist on seeing the absolute without first taking the time to understand its actual nature, you open a massive door to deception. Blind dependence upon untrained sense perception absolutely does not lead to sudden enlightenment. It leads straight to confusion and being cheated. Unscrupulous individuals know exactly how to exploit this specific brand of spiritual ignorance. They know for a fact that if you're just looking for a superficial visual show, they can easily manufacture one right in front of you. Have you ever been fooled by an optical illusion or a really slick magic trick? Our eyes deceive us constantly. In the spiritual realm, relying solely on that same untrained vision leaves you entirely vulnerable to cheap tricks.
Because people want a cheap, immediate visual thrill, they fall prey to false incarnations, ordinary men presenting themselves with a manufactured divine aura. They get swept up by imitation gurus who perform cheap parlor magic, and they buy into twisting, misleading philosophies that might sound really profound to a contaminated mind, but have absolutely no basis in true spiritual reality. So, if our senses are this blunt and our demands to see it to believe it are just setting us up to be cheated, what's the actual solution? Let's move to section 4, the authentic Vedic path. True spiritual understanding, it doesn't come from amateur experimentation. It comes through parampara, which is the authoritative disciplic succession. Instead of relying on our own 4 human defects, the Vedic process recommends receiving knowledge downward, directly from those who have genuinely understood the absolute truth. It requires hearing submissively from realized authorities who actually know the subject matter inside and out. It makes perfect sense when you think about it. You'd learn physics from a qualified physicist, right? Not by trying to independently invent calculus in your garage. So here's how that transformation actually plays out, step by step. It begins not with demanding to see, but with step 1, hearing from an authentic authority. This naturally leads into step 2, submissive inquiry, asking questions with a genuine desire to learn, not just to arrogantly challenge. This translates into step 3, sincere practice. And finally, step 4, the purification of consciousness through devotional service. By following this exact tested process, our blunt senses are gradually healed and awakened. We stop artificially demanding to see God because our consciousness actually becomes purified enough to perceive Him. It's basically a tale of 2 entirely different worldviews. On one hand, we have materialistic empiricism. It's built on a blind dependence on fundamentally flawed senses. It arrogantly demands experimental proof on its own terms, and ultimately it leads the seeker right into confusion and cheating. On the other hand, we have the Vedic process. It relies on the tested, unbreakable chain of parampara. It operates through submissive inquiry and devotion, and it leads to an actually purified consciousness where true, genuine perception is finally possible. It really is night and day. The ultimate takeaway from this whole explainer boils down to this profound Vedic conclusion. God is not an object to be experimentally captured by imperfect senses. He reveals himself to the sincere soul who approaches through humility. This completely shifts the burden of proof. The burden is no longer on the absolute truth to jump through the tiny hoops of your defective vision. The burden of proof is firmly on the observer to become qualified. The truth reveals itself only to those who approach with humility, devotion, and authorized spiritual knowledge. I'm going to leave you with this final thought to chew on as we wrap up our look at the true nature of perception. When we encounter the great mysteries of life, are we arrogantly demanding that the absolute truth shrink down to fit into our severely limited, blunt vision? Or are we humble enough and brave enough to actually undergo the process of purifying our own eyes so that we might finally truly see? Thank you so much for exploring this with me, and I really hope this deeply changes how you view your own lens on reality.